Experience life in industrial London. 24 hours during the Industrial Revolution. That is exactly what you are about to live through, not from a textbook, not from a museum, but through the bones and breath of one man who woke up every single day, wondering if this would be the day the city finally swallowed him whole. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and at 4:47 in the morning, in the winter of 1842, the cold hit him before consciousness did. Not the kind of cold you fix with a thermostat or a thicker blanket. This was the kind of cold that lived in the walls, that crawled up through the floorboards, that sat on your chest like a stone and dared you to get up. Thomas opened his eyes in a room no larger than a modern bathroom. He shared it with 5 other men. The air was dense, a sour mix of sweat, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of rot from somewhere beneath the building. The single window, no bigger than a dinner plate, was caked with grime so thick the glass looked painted black. There was no alarm clock. There didn't need to be. The knocker-upper had already come and gone, rapping his long pole against their window 3 sharp times. If you didn't wake, you didn't work. And if you didn't work, you didn't eat. It was that simple. Thomas sat up on the straw mattress he shared with a man named George, a former weaver from Lancashire, whose persistent cough had grown worse every week. George didn't stir. Thomas didn't check on him. In Bethnal Green, in 1842, you learned quickly not to ask questions you didn't want answered. He pulled on his trousers, stiff with grime. His shirt, the same one he'd worn for 11 straight days, clung to his skin. He had no mirror, but it didn't matter. Appearance was a luxury that belonged to another class. He reached under the mattress and pulled out a heel of bread he'd saved from the night before. It was hard as wood, so he held it in his mouth and let his saliva soften it as he laced his boots, the only item he owned that still connected him to his old life in Dorset. Outside, London was not sleeping. London never slept. The streets were already alive with the sound of wooden wheels on cobblestone, the shouts of costermongers setting up their barrows, the distant groan of steam engines warming in the factories along the Thames. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse dung, and something chemical that Thomas had never been able to identify, something that clung to the back of his throat and made his teeth feel gritty. He walked fast, not because he was late, but because standing still in this part of the city was an invitation. Pickpockets, beggars, drunks sleeping in doorways, they were as permanent a feature of Bethnal Green as the crumbling brick itself. Thomas passed a woman sitting on a stoop with a baby in her arms, both of them thin as paper. He looked away, not because he didn't care, but because caring without the power to act was a kind of cruelty he couldn't afford to carry. The factory was a 20-minute walk. Hargrove and Sons Iron Foundry, perched on the south bank like a great dark beast, breathing smoke into the sky. Thomas had worked there for 14 months, 14 months of 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, 14 months of heat so intense near the furnaces that men fainted regularly, and cold so bitter near the loading docks that fingers went white and numb. His wages were 15 shillings a week. After rent, after bread, after the penny he set aside each day for the impossible dream of one day leaving this city, he had almost nothing left. But he kept walking. Because the alternative, the workhouse, the streets, the river, was not an alternative at all. It was an ending. As he approached the factory gates, he saw the children, dozens of them, some as young as 7 or 8, filing in through a side entrance. Their faces were blank, not sad, not scared, just blank. And that emptiness, Thomas thought, was perhaps the most terrifying thing about this city. It didn't just break people, it emptied them. He took a breath. The whistle blew, and the day began. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui a gente não conta história para entreter. A gente conta para que você nunca esqueça o que pessoas reais suportaram para que o mundo em que você vive pudesse existir. Se inscreva agora. Você deve isso a eles. Note, the user requested English output, but the CTA prompt template was in Portuguese. Here is the English version. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because here we don't tell stories to entertain, we tell them so you never forget what real people endured, so the world you live in could exist. Subscribe now. You owe it to them. The noise inside Hargrove and Sons was not something you heard, it was something you became. The relentless clang of hammers on iron, the hiss of steam escaping valves, the grinding of gears that never stopped. It entered through your ears and settled into your skull like a second heartbeat. Thomas had stopped noticing it months ago. That was what frightened him most, not the noise itself, but the fact that his body had accepted it as normal. His station was near the rolling mill where sheets of iron were heated, pressed and shaped. The temperature near the furnace hovered at unbearable levels, even in winter. Men worked in thin shirts soaked through with sweat, their faces blackened, their arms scarred from inevitable burns. There were no gloves, no goggles, no guards on the machines. Safety was a word that belonged in a drawing room, not a factory floor. If you lost a finger, you lost your wage for the days it took to heal. If you lost a hand, you lost your position. If you died, and men did die, more often than anyone outside these walls would ever know, they replaced you before the end of the shift. Thomas worked his station with the mechanical precision that survival demanded. Feed the sheet, watch the rollers, pull it through, stack it, repeat. His muscles knew the rhythm better than his mind did. But today something was different. A boy named William, no older than 9, had been assigned to oil the gears on the machine directly beside Thomas. William was new. You could tell because he still flinched at the sounds. His hands trembled as he reached between the moving parts with a tin of grease, and Thomas could see the foreman, a heavy man named Crawley, watching from across the floor with the particular indifference of someone who had stopped seeing children as children a long time ago. "Keep your elbows in," Thomas muttered without looking at the boy, "and never reach when the wheel's at the top of its turn." William glanced at him with wide eyes. "Yes, sir." "I'm not sir, I'm Thomas, and I'm telling you because the last boy who had your job is missing 3 fingers on his left hand." William swallowed hard and nodded. For the next 3 hours, Thomas watched him from the corner of his eye, correcting his timing, warning him when the machine lurched, and once, just once, grabbing the back of his shirt and yanking him backward half a second before a gear caught a loose thread on his sleeve. William didn't thank him. He just stood there, pale as chalk, breathing hard, staring at the machine that had almost taken his arm. At noon, the whistle blew for the 30-minute meal break. 30 minutes, that was all. Thomas sat on an overturned crate near the loading dock and unwrapped a piece of cheese and another crust of bread. William sat beside him without asking. The boy ate nothing. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then broke his bread in 2 and handed half to the boy. "I can't take your food," William said. "You can and you will. A hungry boy makes mistakes, and mistakes in there cost more than bread." William took it. He ate it so fast he nearly choked, and then, quietly, he said, "My mum sent me here. She said I'd earn enough for us to eat proper. She doesn't know what it's like inside." Thomas said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The boy's mother had done what every mother in London's East End did. She had made an impossible choice between hunger and danger, and she had chosen the one that at least carried the possibility of survival. The afternoon shift began with a change in the air. Something felt wrong. The machine seemed louder, the foreman more agitated. Word travelled down the factory floor the way it always did, in whispers and glances. There had been an inspection threatened. A member of Parliament, one of the reformers, was reportedly touring factories along the Thames. Crawley had spent the morning barking orders to clean up visible hazards, to move the youngest children out of sight, to hide the evidence of what everyone already knew but no one was supposed to say out loud. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the air quality. He had seen this before, the performance of respectability, the theatre of compliance. The inspectors would come, see a relatively orderly factory, nod their heads, and leave. And by the next morning, everything would return to exactly the way it was. Nothing would change, it never did. But then at 3:30, a scream cut through the noise of the factory like a knife through cloth. It came from the weaving section on the upper floor. Thomas moved fast. By the time he reached the upper floor, a crowd had already gathered. A girl, maybe 12 years old, had gotten her hair caught in a spinning mule. They had managed to stop the machine, but not before it had pulled her forward and slammed her head against the iron frame. She was alive but bleeding badly, a gash across her temple that exposed white bone beneath. Crawley arrived, looked at the girl, and said 5 words that Thomas would never forget. Get her out. Keep working. No doctor was called. No one stopped production. 2 women carried the girl down the stairs and out through a back door while the rest of the workers stood in silence, their faces carrying that same terrible blankness Thomas had seen on the children that morning. The machine was restarted within 4 minutes. Thomas returned to his station. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from fatigue, from something deeper, something that had been building inside him for 14 months. It was rage. Not the explosive kind that leads to broken things. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your stomach like a coal and slowly burns everything around it until there is nothing left but resolve. He looked at William, who was standing frozen at his post, tears running silently down his soot-covered face. Thomas put his hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed once. "Keep your hands moving," he said, "and remember what you saw. Because one day someone is going to ask you what it was like, and you're going to tell them the truth." The whistle blew at 6:30, and the workers poured out of Hargrove and Sons like water from a cracked pipe. Slowly at first, then all at once, every one of them carrying the same exhaustion in their shoulders, the same dullness in their eyes. Thomas walked beside William until they reached the corner where their paths split. The boy looked up at him. "Will she be all right? The girl?" Thomas hesitated. He could lie. It would be the kind thing. But kindness built on lies was just another form of cruelty. "I don't know," he said, "but I know she won't be the last. Not unless something changes." William nodded, too old for his years, and disappeared into the labyrinth of narrow streets that made up Southwark. Thomas watched him go, then turned north toward Bethnal Green. The evening air was thick with fog, not the romantic silver kind that poets wrote about, but the yellow-brown variety that Londoners called a pea souper. It was coal smoke, trapped by low clouds, a blanket of poison that settled over the city and turned every breath into a negotiation. Thomas pulled his collar up over his nose and walked with his head down. He stopped at a public house on Commercial Street. Not to drink, he couldn't afford it, but because a man named Arthur Briggs held meetings there on Wednesday evenings. Briggs was a former printer who had lost his job after organizing a petition for shorter working hours. Now he spent his evenings in the back room of the King's Arms, talking to anyone who would listen about the rights of working men, about the Chartists, about the idea, radical, dangerous, almost unthinkable, that ordinary people deserved a voice in the laws that governed their lives. Thomas had come to 3 of these meetings before. He never spoke. He just listened. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the image of that girl's head striking the iron frame was burned into the back of his eyes, and the sound of Crawley's voice played on a loop in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. Briggs stood at the front of the room, a small man with wire spectacles and hands stained permanently black with ink. There were perhaps 20 men crowded into the space, sitting on barrels and crates, their faces lit by 2 tallow candles that filled the room with a greasy, flickering light. "They tell us to be grateful," Briggs said, his voice steady and low, "grateful for the privilege of destroying our bodies so that other men can build palaces. Grateful for wages that wouldn't feed a dog. Grateful for the chance to watch our children crawl into machines and come out broken. And when we dare to say that this is wrong, that a man who works 12 hours a day deserves to eat, to rest, to see his children grow up whole, they call us agitators, radicals, dangerous men." He paused. "Well, perhaps it's time we became dangerous." The room was silent. Thomas felt his heart pounding, and before he knew what he was doing, he stood up. "I saw a girl nearly killed today," he said. His voice was rough, unfamiliar to him in this context. He was a man who worked with his hands, not his words, but the words came anyway. 12 years old, her head split open by a machine she should never have been near, and the foreman didn't call a doctor. He didn't stop the line. He told us to keep working, as if she was nothing, as if her blood on the floor was just another mess to clean up. He paused. The room was absolutely still. "I came to this city because I was told there was work here, and there is. But what they didn't tell me is that the work would cost me everything I thought I was. I've watched men lose fingers and say nothing. I've watched children walk into that factory every morning with empty faces and come out emptier. And I've said nothing too, because I was afraid, because I thought staying quiet was the same as staying safe. He looked around the room. It's not. Staying quiet is how they win, and I'm done being quiet. If these words moved something inside you, write in the comments right now. Their silence was never peace. Let the world see how many of us refuse to look away from history. Thomas left the King's Arms at 9:30 and walked home through streets that had grown darker and more dangerous with the falling night. Gas lamps lined the main roads, casting weak pools of yellowish light that only made the shadows deeper. In the alleys and courts there was no light at all, just the occasional glow of a pipe or the flash of eyes from a doorway. He thought about what he had done. Speaking up in that room meant risk. Men who organized, men who spoke against factory owners, men who signed petitions. They were watched. They were blacklisted. They were sometimes arrested or simply beaten in an alley and left as a warning. Thomas knew this. And yet, for the first time in 14 months, he felt something other than exhaustion. He felt awake. When he reached his lodging house, he climbed the narrow stairs to his room. George was asleep, his breathing labored, each exhale carrying a wet, rattling sound that Thomas tried not to think about. Thomas sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled off his boots. His feet were blistered. His back ached. His hands were raw, but his mind was clear. He reached into his boot and pulled out the penny he'd saved that day. He held it in his palm. 1 penny. That was what he saved each day toward the dream of leaving London. At this rate, it would take years, maybe decades, maybe forever. But the dream wasn't really about leaving anymore, was it? Somewhere between this morning and this moment, the dream had changed. It wasn't about escape. It was about making this place, this brutal, grinding, smoke-choked city, into something that didn't require escaping from. He put the penny back in his boot, lay down on the mattress, and closed his eyes. Outside, London continued its relentless hum. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a woman sang a lullaby through a thin wall. Somewhere a factory furnace burned through the night, preparing for the morning shift, preparing to consume another day of human life in exchange for iron and profit. Thomas Whitmore slept, not peacefully. Peace was another luxury that didn't belong to men like him, but deeply. The deep sleep of a man who had finally decided that survival alone was not enough. The knocker-upper came at 4:47, same as always. 3 sharp raps on the window. Thomas opened his eyes. For a moment, everything was the same. The cold, the dark, the smell, the stiffness in every joint. But then he turned to wake George, and George did not respond. Thomas shook his shoulder. Nothing. He pressed his hand against George's chest and felt stillness where there should have been movement. George, the weaver from Lancashire, the man who had coughed every night for the past 3 months, who had worked beside Thomas at the foundry, who had never once complained about anything except the price of tobacco. George was dead. He had died in the night, quietly, without drama or ceremony, the way poor men in London died, unnoticed, unmourned by anyone who had the power to have prevented it. Thomas sat beside him for a long moment, his hand still resting on George's chest. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He simply sat and let the weight of it settle into him. Another stone added to the pile he carried every day. The other men in the room stirred, saw what had happened, and reacted with the grim efficiency of people accustomed to death. One went to fetch the landlord. Another began gathering George's few belongings, a comb, a letter from someone named Mary, a pair of reading spectacles with a cracked lens. Thomas looked at the spectacles and thought about all the things George had seen through those broken lenses. The green fields of Lancashire, the grey walls of the workhouse, the orange glow of the foundry, and finally the darkness of this room. This small, cold, forgettable room where a man's life had ended and the world had not paused for even a second. Thomas stood, dressed, and walked to the factory. Because that is what you did, that is what you had to do. But when he arrived at Hargrove and Sons, something was different. There was a carriage parked outside the gates, a fine one, with polished wood and brass fittings. The inspector had come, not the token visit Crawley had prepared for, but a real one, accompanied by a journalist from a London newspaper and a physician who had been documenting factory conditions for a parliamentary report. Thomas watched from the line of workers filing in as the inspector walked through the main floor, his face growing paler with each step. The physician examined the children's hands, blistered, scarred, several with missing fingertips. The journalist wrote furiously in a notebook, and Crawley, for the first time in Thomas's memory, was silent. The inspection lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the inspector addressed the workers directly, something that had never happened before. He said that conditions at Hargrove and Sons were among the worst he had documented. He said there would be a report. He said there would be consequences. Thomas had heard promises before, but this time, standing in the crowd of soot-covered men and hollow-eyed children, he noticed something he hadn't seen in 14 months. He saw hope on their faces, fragile, uncertain, but real. And here is what history does not always tell you. That inspection, and dozens like it across England in the 1840s, led to the Factory Acts, laws that limited working hours, restricted child labour, and mandated basic safety conditions. These laws did not arrive overnight. They did not arrive without resistance. Factory owners fought them with money and influence, and every tool at their disposal. But they came, slowly, imperfectly. But they came. Because ordinary men and women, men like Thomas Whitmore, like Arthur Briggs, like the 20 tired souls in the back room of the King's Arms, refused to stay quiet. Thomas never left London. He never made it back to Dorset. He lived and worked in the city for another 31 years, through reforms and setbacks, through progress and pain. He never became famous. His name appeared in no history book. But he lived. He endured. And in his own small, stubborn, extraordinary way, he fought. And the girl from the factory, the one whose head struck the iron frame, she survived. She carried a scar above her left temple for the rest of her life. Years later, when her own daughter asked her about it, she said it was a reminder that the world is not changed by those who look away. It is changed by those who look directly at what is broken and say, simply and firmly, this must stop. 24 hours in industrial London. That is what you have just experienced. One full rotation of a world that was designed to grind people into dust. And yet, in the middle of all that grinding, in the middle of the smoke and the noise and the relentless mechanical cruelty of progress, there was Thomas. There was a boy named William. There was a man named Briggs with ink-stained hands and a belief that the future could be different. There were 20 men in a back room choosing to be dangerous. Remember them, because the comfort of your world was built on the endurance of theirs. If you watched until this very moment, it's because this story reached something real inside you. Hit the like button. Not for us, but because every like pushes this story towards someone who has never heard it. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what the world used to cost. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because stories like these deserve to be told, and this channel exists to make sure they are. And if you truly stayed until the end, leave a comment saying, I watched until the end, so I can know you, so I can see who really cares about the stories we tell here on this channel. Because you, yes you, are the reason these voices are not forgotten.